So in this video, I'm going to be directly following up the last one, and I know that that video is going to suffer because YouTube and OBS issues. I'll get to that later. But I wanted to talk about why I think that Bionicle tells a story without ever really saying a word. In this video, I specifically want to focus on these two pieces right here. We will also touch on Generation 2's head design, because I talked about it in the last video, and I have much more to say. But I want to focus on these ones specifically because there's something incredibly important right in front of me that really is just so beneficial for kids specifically, relaying information to kids in a way that is accessible and, again, doesn't say anything. So back in 2001 Bionicle, we were introduced to three different waves of characters: the Toamata, the Turaga, and the Matoran, each of which were sort of different tiers of character, if you will. I always saw the Matoran as being sort of the most vulnerable types of characters. They didn't have like melee weapons of any type. They were the smallest, right? They were the most numerous, massable. I saw the Turaga as this sort of middle character here, and of course the Toamata were the most powerful. The interesting thing here, though, and the thing that I adore so much about Generation 1 Bionicle, specifically 2001 and even 2002, is that this holds true from a toy and play perspective. What do I mean by that? It has nothing to do with aesthetics of characters, but back in 2001, this was one of the most common sets you could get your hands on because it was free to a majority of the world anyway, right? This came with a McDonald's Happy Meal. McDonald's being, of course, a very popular fast food franchise, meant you were very likely to find this if you knew what Bionicle was, or even if you were just in McDonald's around that time. It's likely that this could have been your introduction to Bionicle. But what's interesting here is that although this comes with the exact same mask as any of the other sets in terms of the style of it, right, the material it's made of, the head here is different. This is a softer material known as polypropylene, and what's really interesting, what's fascinating about this material, and that is that it is more flexible than ABS. It has some really interesting properties, but why is that head made of polypropylene? Usually, Lego, at least in the early days, would reserve polypropylene for a piece like this, where an axle was directly built into it. And the main reason for this is because they want that axle to be able to take the brunt of the force applied to this piece, right? If you swing it, you don't want this to snap at the end, which ABS can do. You know, it can snap. It is still a flexible material, but polypropylene is far more flexible. So because of that, it's much less likely to break. In fact, I've never had one of these break, but to each their own, right? So I ask myself again, why then would they use that material on a head? This doesn't have an axle coming out of it. In fact, it has axle hole connections. So why bother? There's something else going on here. This material, as I mentioned, is a softer material than ABS. It's more flexible material, but also it is a different material than ABS. And that is important because it sort of negates some types of, well, let's just say atomic bonding, right? And also, just generally, from a feel perspective, polypropylene seems to have a little more slip to it, coefficient of friction, whatever you want to call it, right? It's easier to move polypropylene pieces, and thus it doesn't grip this connection quite as well, meaning that it is easier to knock this mask off of this head than it is to knock this exact same mask off of this head, in which the materials are the same, ABS plastic on both sides. Because this is ABS, it has a stronger clutch on the front of it. Because it is the same material, it's more likely to bond at an atomic level because they're the same, right? And on top of that, there are several other reasons why this ends up working. But something else I wanted to focus on here too, actually, I'll save that for a few moments. So, if we extrapolate this information, if the Turaga are the second weakest or second strongest, depending on how you look at them, should their masks then come off of heads easier than the Toa masks? No. Kind of. Here's where things get fascinating to me. So as I mentioned, the Tohunga sets, the McDonald's Matoran sets, they don't have melee weapons. Instead, they deliver their attack in two ways. They have a throwable disc, not pictured here, but they also have a punch via this piece right here because of its innate flexibility. Also a soft material. And because those fists are reasonably massive, pretty chunky pieces of material, they actually can knock masks off of these heads quite easily. However, the Turaga and of course the Toamata have very similar functions, a slice, a downward slice with their weapons. Where they differ, though, is just the overall design of each of these. First off, this arm is way more massive. That weapon has more material involved in it, so it's going to be heavier. That arm has much more material than this arm, so it's going to be much heavier. And of course, it is much further away from the pivot point. The tip of this is much further away from where it rotates. Whereas this, even at its full extension, even with the staff pushed all the way up as far as it'll go, is much closer to that pivot point, and it's just a less massive weapon overall because the majority of that weapon is just axle, not much else. A really clever way to use a staff as a weapon, right? So it still gets all of the range, but it has less force than, say, a club, for example, a more massive weapon. On top of that, something else to think of is how the function works. This function has a natural limit built into it. It can't spin a full 360, whereas this weapon can, meaning you get a larger arc with your swing and thus can store and deliver more impact force. That is how the Toa are stronger. The mask is not any easier to remove, but it delivers a stronger attack, thus hitting the mask with more force and thus removing masks more easily than Turaga do. So that's where things are different here. What's even more interesting is that IA tested all of the original 2001 masks, Turaga and Toa. Did not test the Vahi for obvious reasons. That's a separate story on its own. But the reason I tested these is because I wanted to sort of see, is my intuition correct? Is any of these masks easier to remove than the others? And from what I could tell, at least from a perspective point, no. Now, I don't have scientific measuring equipment or anything like that. I can't tell you, oh, the minute differences, but any difference between trying to remove these masks, and I tried in two different ways, was marginal at best. I tried with a downward swing, so pushing down on it and measuring roughly how much force from feel that took to remove. All of the masks were about as easy as the other, with the easiest being the Ruru. But even then, it was still marginal at best. The second method I tried was a grab, right? Like a hooking type of attack, but from all sides. Grab and pull. And that was not easier based on any of them from my testing either. That one makes a little bit more sense because the connection is the same, but there are going to be some subtle differences just based on the mask shape alone. So then we look forward and we say, well, there is another mask with the same type of connection aside from the Vahi, right? The Toa Nuva masks. And I do, in my head, see the Toa Nuva as being stronger than the Toa Mata. So in my head, I want these masks to be harder to remove to reflect that, to continue that story. And they are. Kind of. It's really obscure stuff, and I really implore you to look into this stuff more. But the way I tested this was kind of interesting. So, something to note is that the Nuva masks, in all cases, are larger than their Mata counterparts. And that's important, because the larger a mask is, A, the easier it is to hit, it's just a larger target, and B, the more leverage you have over it, because you're further away from the pivot point where the mask connects to the head. And that's something we're going to get to, because that's something that Generation 1 does really well, that Generation 2 does not so well. But in this case here, this mask is easier to hit, but what I've noticed is by my testing, because I call these sort of cumulative hit masks, that's a bad name for it, but the point I'm trying to get at is that these masks sort of remember how many times you've hit them. How do I mean that? So the way that this connection works is that it is just being grabbed onto, but each time you hit this mask, you're loosening it just a little bit, and the mask isn't going to reset itself. It has no method of doing that with this connection. And so the more you hit a mask, the more likely it is to fall off until eventually it gets knocked off. And I tested that versus this mask, and it was harder to knock these masks off. One reason I suspect for that is that these masks are a thicker material, slightly. They're slightly more massive as well, which means that their resonance is going to be different. The way they absorb energy is going to be different. So that's something notable. But on top of that, I also measured that pull force, again, purely by hand, right? And they are significantly harder to remove from these heads. I really admire all that. Now, there are some outliers as well, like these masks, which came with the hockey sets from Technic, which are masks. They do connect to these heads. They're designed for the polypropylene heads that I talked about earlier. But also, the other important thing to get to, this is where we shift into Generation 1 versus Generation 2 for a moment, is the way that these connect. So I touched on this in the last video, but I wanted to go into it a little bit further because with these masks, I only really measured 2 different methods for removing the mask. However, with Generation 2, I measured like 6, and there's a handful of reasons for that. I'm literally going to probably create like an Excel spreadsheet covering all of them and sort of their strengths and weaknesses, but there are a handful of reasons. We'll get to why in a moment. First off, the thing to know about these masks is that the connection point, which is right here, is towards the front, towards the face of the mask, right? Whereas the point you're most likely to hit because of that downward swing of the Toamata arm is roughly this area up here. And you'll note, if we just look at it from the side, that this is further back than this point. Essentially, if you took a straight line and connected that mouth connection to the back of this mask, you're going to have an angle like this. So let's copy that over for a moment to levers. If this right here is the mouth connection, this is the point you're most likely to hit, and you're hitting it with a downward swing, right? With a downward arc too. Not coming straight down, but you're actually rotating. It's very easy to collapse, to compromise that connection. That makes sense. When we look at Generation 2, however, the connection is substantially different. And in fact, I'm going to use a different axle here because that axle does not want to stay in place. So this connection, I'm going to use Galley's mask for this demonstration here, is directly beneath the point which you're likely to hit, right? So it connects right here to the head, and you're most likely to hit this area here with that downward swing. In fact, it's nearly impossible to hit behind that because that's the furthest point back minus these 2 little corners here. And the reason that's important is because, again, if you draw a straight line, it's literally a straight line. It aligns with this axle here. That's a problem because that means instead of hitting it at this angle, matching that line, you're hitting it from this angle, matching this line, that straight line. And that's perpendicular to the point at which it connects. It is not over center, meaning that when I swing at this, it's not likely to compromise that connection. And this is also a self-resetting connection. This doesn't have the memory that I talked about. The reason I say that is because this is a stress-based connection. Currently, it is not stressed. You can tell because the mask can wobble. It can move freely on that head. When I remove the mask, it is not stressed for obvious reasons. There's nothing stretching those pieces apart. But when you're halfway between, those parts are being stressed, and it wants to relieve that stress. So it's going to do one of 2 things. It's either going to go out and disconnect, or it's going to go back in and reconnect to the head. And that's where one of the problems lies. So I can't test these downward swings. I mean, I can with some masks, but it doesn't translate across the board. It's not consistent in the way it was with Generation 1. Where Generation 1, all of the Matoran were weaker than the Toamata, and the Toamata and Turaga masks were all roughly identical in how they behaved, but the character dealing the attack had an advantage based on what character it was, Toa or Turaga. That same does not apply here for a handful of reasons. A, because the master sets are not clone sets. They have slightly different lengths of weapons, for one thing. Some weapons are enormous. Tahu Master's weapon, for example, whereas some weapons are relatively small. And in the case of like Pohatu Master, his weapon has a bend in it as well. So if you hit something with the tip of that weapon, it's just going to bend back. It's not going to knock anything off, or it's less likely to, right? But on top of that, when I ask myself, okay, if the Matoran mask is easier to knock off because the Matoran are the most vulnerable, what is the analog to that in Generation 2? The Protectors, right? So is the Protector mask easier to knock off? Yes, but not for the reasons I described. The mask is reasonably large at the top, and it has protrusions that stick out quite far. And those 2 things mean that if you hit those protrusions, you're more likely to knock the mask off because A, those protrusions go much further back, meaning they're no longer over center, but they're pushed back a little bit. And B, because they have a pretty good distance that they can travel, it's going to torque the mask downward, right? And thus it's going to, in essence, pull up on the bottom, and that will help to remove it from the head. It's not a one-to-one analogy, it's not perfect, but because all of the Protectors have the same mask, they are generally going to be weaker. However, the thing that actually matters is the connection. Is the connection of the Protector mask weaker or stronger? No. So this is where things get kind of unfortunate, in my opinion. Generation 2 does not have the same internal consistency that Generation 1 does. Matorn are the easiest to defeat. Turaga are second easiest to defeat in the sense that they can't deal a lot of damage back to you. Toa are third easiest to defeat, and then Toa Nuva are the hardest to defeat of the bunch. So I look at the protectors, and yeah, they're kind of the easiest to defeat. They don't have any sort of swinging arc. They shoot studs. Studs don't impact with a lot of force. They're not going to knock a mask off. Looking at the Toa Master sets then, I have to think these should all be comparable, right? Because they're the same wave, but they're not. This mask and this mask require different amounts of force to knock off. And when you look at the price point, you might think, okay, well, Tahu's is more expensive, so his should be harder to knock off. No, this one's harder to knock off. This was actually among the easiest. And in fact, I classified 4 different tiers: easiest, medium, hard, and very hard to knock off. And there was no pattern that I could see here for a couple of reasons. This was in the easy category, but interestingly, this was in the medium category. And in fact, this right here created the medium category because it was slightly too easy to knock off. So it wasn't quite as hard to knock off as this mask, but it was slightly harder to knock off than Tahu Mata's mask. It literally had to have its own. And on top of that, Onua Uniters was also about as hard as this one. So then I think, okay, so the Uniter masks are easier to knock off. But no, because this mask, which is the Uniter mask, was the hardest to knock off. And this mask was the hardest to knock off. These were the only 2 in the hard category. And this and Onua Uniters were the only 2 in the medium category. And then about half-ish were in the hard but not super hard category like these 2, and then about the other half were in the easy category. I'm getting confusing here, but the point I'm trying to get at is that there was no consistency between them, and on top of that, there are a lot of variables that affect how these connect. So as an example, I pull back up those hockey masks for a second. These are really hard to remove from heads because A, they're not designed around the mask gimmick. They just use that head as a connection because it's convenient, right? Lego didn't have to mold a piece. It is a polypropylene piece, so it does have that material bonding that I mentioned earlier, but also the stud connection there is significantly longer than the stud connection of the Mata or even Nuva masks. And also, this mask generally hugs this face much more than any of the other masks do, so it's much harder to remove because there's just less material to grab onto to try to remove it in the first place. It's not impossible, obviously, I can do it right there, but these clasps on the sides here are not all the same. So I mentioned this not being the same, but all of the other studs are, again, with the exception of Onu and Nuva for some reason. I don't know why. But this clasp that I show you right here, and you may be able to see it, yes, is reinforced. It has an extra bit of plastic on the outside. Some masks have this, some masks don't. And reinforcement is important because those clasps are generally, as a rule of thumb, going to be stronger than clasps that don't have that. However, that's not the only factor that affects how easy it is to knock off the masks, because the length of the clasp matters too. If you've got something that's a longer material, for example, it's going to be easier to bend than if I were to cut this axle in half and try to bend it, or cut it into a fourth and try to bend that. It's very tough to bend, right? And since these are stress-related connections, they're going to be harder to bend if they're shorter, right? So I actually looked in there. I didn't measure it with like measuring tape or anything, but I looked in there by eye to see which were the longest, which were the shortest. And the master sets, as an example, had various different lengths. Pohatu Master, for example, had one of the longest clasps that was unsupported. Meanwhile, Liwa Master had one of the shortest clasps that was unsupported. And so in theory, that should translate to Liwa's mask being harder to knock off because that shorter amount of plastic is not going to want to bend outward as much. It's going to be a tighter connection. And yet, Liwa Master's mask was the easiest to knock off of any that I tested. It's insane. Some of this is also going to just be determined by each individual mask because they could get damaged during shipment. They could be damaged because you bought them used. Maybe one was stepped on. Whatever, right? The clasps can have different loosenesses. You get the point. So there's so much to think about. And I didn't even talk about like the eye stalk and that connection. Yeah, I mentioned it briefly in the last video. I did talk about trying to hook the mask from the back and remove it that way because some masks have very little material to grab onto, while other masks have an enormous amount of material to grab onto, like this here. There's just so many variables with Generation 2 that make it A, inconsistent, and B, not even internally consistent. At the very least, I would think to myself, oh, the Uniters should be harder to defeat. And while that's technically true because they have the shorter eye stalk, so they have a smaller leverage, they have a smaller mechanical advantage, right? It's not true in the sense that the masks are any more difficult. If you paired those masks with a different eye stalk, you would get different results, and even amongst themselves, you still get different results, even with the same eye stalks. It's insane the amount of detail I went into with all this stuff. Suffice to say, I have a lot of admiration for the design and the amount of time spent on these little guys right here. 2001 Bionicle is one of my favorite years for obvious reasons. This is just one of them, and this is just a premise that I thought of last night when I was trying to sleep at like 1 o'clock. Plus, by the way, just to annoy you before the end of this video, this is not a symmetric piece. Have fun exploring that. But the last thing I want to say before ending the video is that if you like content like this, make sure, please, to subscribe and like this video. It really helps out. It tells YouTube that I'm doing okay over here. I tried recording this video like so many times already. On top of that, you can also help out by hitting notifications and leaving a comment below. Specifically for this video, I would like to know your thoughts on the mask gimmick from 2001 Bionicle, or just Bionicle Generation 1 in general, and how that evolved over time versus the mask gimmick of Generation 2. But if you don't want to talk about that, we can just talk about masks in general. Which one is your favorite? Which one is your least favorite? And why? And of course, you can also take the conversation further over on Discord. Check out the Instagram. And if you want to help support the channel and videos like this, check out the Patreon, all of which are linked in the description below. I'll see you all in the next one. And if I ever get to that spreadsheet thing, it will be available over on Discord for free. Take care, guys.